Welcome to Love in the Wild, the podcast where healing gets real, dating can be complicated, and self-love is the main character energy we're all here for. I'm your host, Katelyn and recovering people pleaser, expert red flag spotter, and your personal cheerleader through every glow up, breakdown, and late night overthinking spiral. Every week, we're diving into love, heartbreak, boundaries, and the wild ride of becoming that girl. Healed, happy, and unbothered. So grab your matcha, your journal, or just your AirPods, because around here, we don't chase love, we become it. Hey, here we go. So if you have ever wondered why calm feels boring, why you're drawn to the same types of partners, or why your body reacts before your brain does, this episode is for you. I'm joined by Jessica Maguire of Repairing the Nervous System, a researcher, author, and speaker who helps people repair their nervous systems after trauma and reconnect with love from a place of safety instead of survival. Together, we are unpacking what it means to regulate before you relate and how learning to calm your body can completely transform the way you give and receive love. So if you're ready to move from anxious or avoidant to secure and grounded, this one's going to hit home. So let's get into it. I am here with Jessica, and I'm going to let you do a little bit of an intro.
Hi, Katelyn. Thank you so much for the very warm welcome. I've been really excited to chat to you. I think this is a beautiful intersection of how the shared networks of our physical health and our emotional health also meet with our relational health. And probably one of the most overlooked parts of the nervous system is how our relationships can be a portal to understanding our nervous system, and also how important things like co-regulation are for both our physical and emotional health too.
Yes, I found your page, and I've been doing a lot of healing on my own, but, I've always read that, trauma, which doesn't necessarily need to be something huge, but it can be something that really affected your life, kind of gets stored in the body. And I did a podcast about a week ago, and it was really exciting to learn that, when we're retraining our nervous system kind of gets started from when we're children. And so the idea of like retraining your nervous system is really like a conscious effort to like grow with you, so to speak. Like, we go into like financial literacy and we go into healing, but then we have this nervous system that is just stuck in, this past. So I was like, when I found your page, I was like, well, first of all, I need to do this for myself. And then I was like, oh my gosh, my listeners need to know about this. So can you explain kind of what a healthy nervous system is and how to give examples of ways we end up in like a dysregulated nervous state?
Yeah, I love that you shared that because I think it's really interesting. I've come from a background in physiotherapy, and I worked a lot in neurology, but also I saw a lot of people with long-term injuries, and we spoke a lot about looking at being able to retrain the nervous system, more the central nervous system, like the brain, particularly after people had experienced things like a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. And that is really looking at the foundations of neuroplasticity. And, we talk a lot about healing. And if we want to be really technical and say, well, what's happening with healing? There is a neuroplastic process taking place, which means that we are having changes in neurons connecting. So if you look at a stroke, or a person who's had a stroke and they lose function to, say, their opposite upper limb, we can target the areas of their brain to reconnect nerves. We can look at getting nerves around that area to connect. And we see significant changes can happen with using, it's normally like 3 hours a day of therapy initially. So what my approach has always been to the autonomic nervous system is looking at, well, how can we create neuroplastic changes? Because where we see people's nervous system, after a traumatic event, push them towards anxiety or shutdown, it's actually through the process of neuroplasticity that they become hypervigilant, they become protective. And so we probably think like, well, the nervous system's just taking in information passively, but we know that it's like reshaping itself based on our experiences. So I really love how you've said that, because we can deliberately create experiences that changes our nervous system and neuroplasticity takes place. But to answer your question on the different states, it's really useful to think of our autonomic nervous system a little bit like a car. So we can have the gas or the accelerator, which is when we want to mobilize energy. And, stress gets a bad rap. Like people are saying stress is so bad, but stress is really this part of our nervous system, the accelerator, called the sympathetic nervous system state, mobilizing energy so that we can meet a challenge or a threat or a demand. And we have the inbuilt capacity to recover fully from that. So that recovery process is initiated via the vagus nerve. And that's like, you put the brake on with your foot. So when we talk about regulation, it's really that process of recovery from mobilization. But for some people, and this is where the incredible work of Stephen Porges comes into play, in the time of a traumatic event, it's a little bit like the handbrake got pulled on. So they might have froze, they might have shut down, which is a beautiful adaptation to keep safe. But through the process of neuroplasticity, it can become a default today. And so people can find themselves shutting down, collapsing, feeling hopeless, helpless, giving up. So that's one pattern we see, which we can say is hypoarousal of the nervous system. But then for other people who experience anxiety, it can mean there's too much of that accelerator, too much sympathetic nervous system energy. So it really gives rise for us to have three states. We have regulation, which is like a band in the middle. We have too much mobilization, which is the accelerator's down, we're going too fast. And then we have immobilization, like the handbrake is pulled on.
Okay. I smiled halfway through because I am one of the most anxious cucumbers on this planet. I'm like, okay, it makes sense. I have that extra speed, I guess you were saying. But what are some ways and kind of like steps that either side can take to be a little bit more regulated? Like when they're in a moment where they feel a ton of anxiety or they feel a moment where they're going to shut down, and they've healed enough to know that, okay, this is my nervous system, this is my body going into this state. How can I stop that from continuing and be a little bit more regulated?
It's a great question. And it all begins with really knowing your state. So this is challenging because it's not like a cognitive thing. It's actually in the moment, being able to go, I'm multitasking, I'm rushing, I've got all this urgency, and I actually maybe do have enough time. It just feels like there's, I've got to go faster, quick. So that's where we might go, okay, here's the urgency, here's the hurrying, here's the multitasking. How can I slow things down and do one thing at a time? Now that's huge, like being able to just stop for a minute. Then for people who tend to get that too much mobilization, I think one of the most helpful things in that time is to be able to discharge some of that mobilizing energy. And that can come through shaking, it can come through allowing our body to move. Now, it's really funny, right? Because people say, I go to meditation and, people say sit down and be still, and my body's like, no. And I think there's a part of this where we try to have a little bit of top-down control over our body. But, the fight energy of fight or flight, that is part of the sympathetic nervous system state. And sometimes the best thing we can do is actually allow our body to carry out that primal force of fight, to contract the muscles and let the body contract. And when we sit down and try and meditate, instead of getting that amplification, we let the process complete. So recovery can happen. I think that's really missing in probably a bit in the wellness space. There's a lot around um, thinking self-regulation is sitting down on a mat and calming ourselves, but it's not necessarily the right thing for everybody. So movement is definitely helpful. And then for people who tend to fit that immobilization, um, we also want to help them to reconnect with their body, because often there's a disconnect. But the other interesting thing that tends to happen, and this segues so beautifully to our conversation today, is in that state of immobilization, people tend to isolate themselves, cut off, and stonewall. And there's that sense of I'm alone. Like people describe it as being I'm in a dark room all by myself. So that connection or that reconnection, reaching out, even through a text message or just going to a place where people are, can bring back that primal sense of belonging again. And that can really help.
I like all of those because they're, again, being more on the anxious side. I've always been told, go take a yoga class, like meditate. And I'm like, that makes me more anxious. Like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, I'm anxious because I have so much stuff to do. And you're telling me that I need to just sit and zen out. I'm like, I could be using this time for so much more. But then I also see those people that are, how you're mentioning, they feel like they're alone and they, retract. And these things are just very, I would say intentional. Like, it's like you have to know and you have to, correct me if I'm wrong, like be mentally strong enough to get yourself out of it.
Yes. There's a large part, I think, of just seeing it at play. So it's like, that scurrying flight energy that gets us all wound up, and then we're multitasking, and then the multitasking gets us even more wound up and we're like feeling scrambled and overwhelmed. It's not until we can say, whoa, stop. I can see this now, what's at play. This is my nervous system. It's not me. Then we're able to choose something different. I think the challenge is people don't have a knowledge of the nervous system and a really not the cognitive checklist way, but an embodied understanding of this is my nervous system playing out. Okay, this might not be the truth of what's actually happening because it's so compelling and its language is feelings and sensations. So it also creates stories. Like, you hear in that sympathetic nervous system state, the story is there's not enough time. I've got to go faster. You'll hear things are going to fall apart if I don't do X, Y, and Z. So it's really interesting when we see sensations, we see emotions, urges, and also stories from a particular state and get to recognize that very quickly.
And this is all why I saw your page and I was like, I am so fascinated by this because I wonder how many people live the majority of their life not ever knowing this and, creating these stories or creating this like ecosystem of their life based around their nervous system. And they don't necessarily know that it's happening.
Yeah, exactly. I think that for many people who are struggling, there isn't a framework to support, to understand, to piece together. And I think, when we bring groups of our students together at our workshops or at our programs and they have a conversation, one of the first things that they'll say after group work is, I can't believe I'm not alone in this. Like other people feel this way too. So I think that in itself is really helpful to know, there's not something wrong with us. It is the way that our nervous system has learned to respond. And also, there can be external things that an environment like modern life can be dysregulating. And I think there's a part of that where we stop personalizing it as, I'm too weak or sensitive or needy or whatever it might be, and say, well, to be a mother and work and all of those things that come along with it take a lot of energy, thinking, planning, working, and then things don't always go to plan. So I think there's a part of acknowledging the challenge now in modern.
That's really good. I went to a birthday party yesterday at a bowling alley and there were probably 20 kids. And at one point I was like, I'm so overwhelmed. There's like noises and yelling, and my kids are both going this way and then trying to have an adult conversation. And I probably should have just prepared myself a little bit better in the moment to say, whatever is going to happen is going to happen. And don't count on an adult conversation, but it's going to be fun for the kids. Like going into moments where it's like been to birthday parties, that every single time they're overwhelming and there's kids screaming and being pulled in every direction. I saw on your Instagram, because I was stalking you like the CIA with all of this information. And one
Oh,
thing I really wanted to know, and I might be saying this wrong, but what is allostatic load?
it's
Because
a
that
great question.
the whole conversation, it was like like I just kept reading the carousel. And it was like wanting to know more.
Okay, do I have permission to nerd out here, Caitlin, for a little bit?
Yes, please. I nerded out on your page. So now this is me giving permission to like nerd out to the whole community.
Great. Thank you. I love nerding out on this. So, what we were talking about in that process of mobilizing energy and then coming back down again, that whole cycle is something we call allostasis. So, rather than saying, I feel stressed, we could say, okay, there's this mobilization of energy that's happening to get me ready to face a challenge or meet a demand. Now, talking to you, I can feel a mobilization of my energy because I want to talk about this. I want to, be on. And this is where we can say it's tied into peak performance. But that mobilization is being kept in check by the vagus nerve. And then afterwards, there'll be a recovery cycle. So I think it's helpful for us to, look at what we're labeling as stress and look at our conversation around cortisol, because cortisol gets a really bad rap. People call it a stress hormone. But cortisol's job is to mobilize glucose so that we have energy to face what's happening. And in this way, glucose isn't good or bad. It's just got a role to play in helping us, mobilize energy. What can happen from chronic and traumatic stress is that let's say chronic stress first, we don't get the recovery. Now, I saw this right before COVID. There was like these really bad bushfires that went through in Australia near where I live. And so some of my patients had the bushfires first that was threatening their property, like really scary stuff. And then before they got the chance to recover from that, COVID hit. Some of them then lost their businesses. So there was this like stress, no recovery, stress, no recovery, stress, no recovery. And so there was this mobilization, and instead of coming back to a baseline after a stressful event, they never came back. And so what that means is that if we take cortisol again, it means that there is a continual production of cortisol being mobilized. And we might say, well, what does that mean? So we'll see that cortisol plays a role in regulating our immune system. So for those people who had this ongoing activation of their nervous system and their immune system was also mobilized along with that, we can say that there is a change in how their immune system functioned. And if this went on for a long, long time, we might say, well, the allostatic load is referring to how we are getting this wear and tear in our brain body system from chronic stress. We can look at it in traumatic stress too, which is more of an amplification of that, where, take digestive issues. Digestive issues are huge in people who have nervous system dysregulation. And even things like irritable bowel syndrome has now been reclassified as a disorder of gut-brain interaction. So it's not about just don't eat any dairy, although that might be important. It's really more about the vagus nerve's gut-brain signaling that's changed from chronic and traumatic stress. So if we look at what happens in a short stressful time, like, an acute stressor, we would have the blood move away from our gut and go out to our extremities. When you feel the butterflies in your tummy and the feeling, sometimes, you can feel nauseous. That can be that shift in blood going out to the extremities. So that's helpful in the short term. But when people are chronically stressed or they have that traumatic stress, then instead of having that blood flow return back to the gut when recovery happens, it stays moving out to the extremities. And so what happens then is that they experience things like poor motility or movement of food through the digestive system. They get changes in the pH, changes in the microbiome, and they can experience things like constipation, gut pain. And people think, well, this gut issue is totally separate from what's happening in my nervous system. But we can really see that the nervous system is like a foundation for how all of these other systems are operating. So allostatic load typically can show up in the digestive system. It can show up in the immune system and as pain. And, you'll often hear people say that sleep is one of the things that are impacted the most for them as well. So huge overlap between physical and emotional health.
That brings me to my next question, because in the dating world, maybe this is me from a dysregulated place, maybe it's from a regulated place, I'm not sure. You could probably tell me better. But in my past, I have dated people, and I won't go into details because, we don't want to throw them under the bus at this point. But dated people where in like a long-term relationship, it was, what you're saying, like all these things. Like my health declined, my hair was falling out. I was like in this constant state of stress and, just constantly feeling like I had almost like rocks in my stomach. Like I was like,
Mm.
I just feel this constant level of stress. And now in dating, almost like my nervous system knows, like they can kind of feel when those little triggers start popping back up, where it's like, maybe this person isn't great for me, maybe this person is, but is that coming from a place of like a dysregulated, or is that like dating from survival? Like what does that kind of look like when you like bring it back to dating?
I think dating is so awesome and for seeing our nervous system. And I found this with my husband as well. It was like a corrective experience because I dated very similar types of men that often led to the similar patterns playing out. And I think it can both be true what you're saying, but I guess this comes down to what is a trigger, what feels like a response from maybe even childhood, and what is today, what is real and true today. So we might meet someone and there's lots of chemistry and excitement and we feel drawn to somebody and we find that there's a familiarity of that anxiety, where they're not consistent with their communication. Maybe we feel like that's part of the buzz. And I know for me, my husband is incredibly steady and grounded and predictable. And, there were times where that was really unfamiliar to me, that it actually felt a little bit, because it was so unfamiliar, it made me feel a little bit anxious. So I think there's part where it's useful for us to reflect on our own patterns. And so if we tend to be in that sympathetic state, like more anxious, we might find that we look outwards a little bit more to be, is everything okay? Am I okay? Is this relationship okay? I think empaths might say, here, I'm really aware of other people's moods and I can feel them. And if you think back to childhood for an empath, they might have grown up in an environment where they had to be aware of somebody else's moods and emotions to see if they were safe or if love was going to be consistent. And so the goal for somebody who might default to that pattern is to learn how they can develop a little bit more, I'm not going to say self-soothing, but a way to develop more self-regulation so that there's a discernment of today. Actually, the way that you're treating me is not enough. So I'm not going to continue in this cycle, rather than when are they going to message me? When are they going to contact me? There's a difference there. One feels really triggering. One feels like we really need somebody else to behave in a way for us to feel safe. The other one is I feel safe already and I can be discerning of somebody else's behavior in a little bit more of an objective way. That's not easy. These aren't cognitive processes. These are patterns. These are nervous system patterns. So to answer that for you, I think we will see patterns play out, and it's finding a way to come back to regulation and then look at the situation. Think about like when you put on one pair of glasses that's like, we could say rose colored glasses, but it's, it's like you have that anxious attached pattern. You are going to almost be feeling like, it's like sitting by the phone. But if we bring ourselves back to regulation, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses and we can say, how does this situation look now?
I like that because and I guess maybe like one telltale sign just from that as someone who's in the dating space or, looking for a partner, if you ask yourself almost like not does this trigger me? Like do I feel safe with them no matter what? Like are they giving me the things that make me feel safe? And that might almost correlate back to almost like a dysregulated nervous system. So where they're saying, you're like, I feel safe, I feel familiar, and they're giving you the things that you need. I dated somebody one time who was like, what do I need to do? And wanted a checklist. And I was like, if you do the checklist, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
But that's lovely that they wanted to try, but, yeah, it may not sit so great for what you're looking for as well.
Yeah, I was like, I don't want to keep doing the checklist thing, and this was the same person who heightened all of my like anxious tendencies and I was, just physically almost shutting down. And I was like, the checklist isn't gonna solve the things. I mean, what does safety like is there a feeling of safety like in your body from a regulated state? Like obviously not from a dysregulated where you're saying this person feels safe because they're texting me all the time and I'm anxious and I need to know where they are. But is there a regulated state of safety and a feeling associated with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Caitlin. We can look at that state that we come into of regulation, which is actually the branch of the vagus nerve that runs from our brainstem down to our heart's pacemaker. I was explaining that a little bit like the brake we use with our foot. But when we come into that state of regulation, we will feel ourselves slow down if we tend to be more anxious. Like there'll be like a slowing down and it can feel like a real settling in our body. And I think there comes like that sense of like, I can take a deep breath again. And for some people, when they come into that state, they'll notice like a discharge of that stress activation, like we were talking about with the feeling of the body letting go, a feeling of change in the blood circulation back to the center of the body. And it's like that narrative of I've got to hurry, I've got to go fast, it changes. But that part of the vagus nerve actually connects with what we call our social engagement system, which is the branch of the vagus nerve running from the heart and it comes up through the muscles to do with communication and speech. And then it comes up to our face and the muscles of the middle ear. So we can actually detect if we are regulated. And we have a sneaky way of detecting if other people are regulated too. One of the main ways is by the sound of their voice. So people being calm don't necessarily talk with a calm, whispery voice like this. There's actually variation in rhythm and pitch. So people with children or a dog might find themselves automatically talking to them saying, like, you see your dog when you get home and you're like, who's the good boy? You're using your voice to co-regulate with your pet. And I do it to my daughter all day. The how's it going with you? And, it's that sing-songy voice that you want to provide that. So listening to people voice is really helpful. And listening to our own voice, if we're in that time of like, say you're connecting with someone and you start to notice that, and like the urge, like I've got to fill every silence with a word, that is a little bit of a clue of that sympathetic energy. And by deliberately slowing your voice, adding a pause, you'll settle yourself as you're talking. So there's ways that we can work with this in the moment. The other thing is those people who are really great co-regulators, they smile with their eyes as well as their mouth. So they have expression in the upper face too. And that's like that gives cues of warmth, and you'll receive cues of warmth through that. Now, when we are in an anxious state, you can tell a little bit because people lose the connection to this cranial nerve called the facial nerve. And so they might smile a little bit like that, and there's no upper face expression. So that's another clue. And the third thing is the muscles of the middle ear, when we're regulated, it changes how we listen. So we will actually be able to hear the sound of the human voice, which is a mid-frequency sound, we say. But when we're dysregulated, these muscles change and we more listen for low frequency predator sounds, it's called. So negotiation is hard when we're dysregulated because we can't even listen properly. You know, if you're really connected with somebody, you can be at a party where there's all this noise and you can just focus in on that person's voice, that one person's voice, and hear them clearly. So we are made to connect, and there are some clues of how that happens when we are in that regulated state, which will be a very different experience to either being anxious or feeling shut down and in freeze.
That is absolutely wild. Like, my mind is just blown because today I was very anxious. We had church and a birthday party, and am normally like more expressive with my eyes and my face. And I caught myself multiple times being like, just,
The little smile.
I'm like, I don't want to do this. Like, it's taking too much time to like be expressive, not knowing that there's like an actual connection with that. And, at the birthday party yesterday, feeling like I was, and I think a lot of moms maybe understand this is you're having a conversation over here, but your eyes are over here. And so you're kind of, no one's really having a conversation if we're being honest. But it's understanding that your brain and your vagus nerve are set for something different because you are dysregulated.
Yes, I can totally relate to what you're saying, Caitlin. Like that, my husband and I were trying to have a conversation about something that needed focus this morning, and my daughter was in the background going, "Purple dress, purple dress, purple dress, purple dress," because she wanted to wear her purple dress. And we just said, okay, this isn't going to work. Because you feel yourself just get this, like, when you're trying to think and you've got noise, it's just your sensory system is getting, like, really wound up from it. So I can totally relate to what you're saying. And yes, I think there's times where you wait till nap time before you have certain talks about things, or, like you're saying with the birthday party, it's very easy to see how overwhelming it can all be with that much going on.
I mean, yeah. Like, I'm gonna look every time and use those kind of, they're not triggers, but like signs, I suppose, where I'm like,
Yes.
I need to re-regulate myself for a little because it's just gonna keep going downhill from there. And I think that's great for anyone in a relationship as well, because I feel like most fights typically happen when one or both people are dysregulated. I mean, you have kids and jobs and house things and just so much life gets brought in, especially when you're joining into people. Like, what is a good way to maybe say, this isn't the right time for a conversation? I know someone who's in your space, and me with the interest of knowing all that you're doing could say, hey, I'm being dysregulated right now. But maybe that's not something that most people would understand. Like, how can you, if you recognize those, say, like, it's not the right time?
I totally love this question because it's something that I find is a challenge. There's things that you've got time pressure on to talk about, and there's not a lot of time when you have small children to talk as a couple in the day. So it is a big challenge. I think the biggest part is having that awareness for yourself, first of all, which is not always easy. And you can technically call it your neurobiological limits. So there's the upper part, which is like, you can have a fluctuation day to day. So if you say before work, someone like a partner or a friend says, before you're about to start work, oh, can I talk to you about something? Your capacity to give them your present regulated attention is likely going to be a lot smaller. And so that your neurobiological limits are a lot less. But let's say it's the end of the day when you finish work and your kids are in bed, your neurobiological limits are a lot higher. So you've got more to give. Timing is a massive one in that, like what's coming up ahead of that. And I think if you start to develop this ability to recognize early on, okay, I'm starting to feel this urgency. I've got this, and this to do. I don't think I can have this conversation right now. If you're starting to recognize that internally, I think the main thing is just saying, this is important to me. I care about you. Let's make a time. I think that's been a really big lesson for me since becoming a mother because, it's often my poor husband who misses out because it goes my daughter and then work, and then he just gets the scraps at the end of the day where I'm like, I just want to watch TV. So it is important. It is really important to try to make that time, and it doesn't work perfectly by any means. I think it's just us recognizing it earlier because when we don't, it sounds more like, I can't talk to you about this right now. And that then feels like rejection because it's the tone of our voice. It's the expression on our face. It's our social engagement system saying no with a message that is, rejecting. So that ability to catch it early, I think, is the main part. For me, there's that multitasking component. And I think trying to stop, and I've had to start doing the, wait, I can't listen to you properly because I can hear, what my daughter's watching on telly blaring and I'm trying to listen to him and it might be hot and there's something else. So I never used to get this overwhelmed before becoming a mother, but there's something with it now where I'm like, I get quickly overwhelmed that I wouldn't have before.
Yeah, and when you're like, it's hot. If I have like the wrong clothes on, like I never used to be this way, but I'm like, my purse is just on me weird and this jacket and I can't function. But I think it is really good to, have that talk and do it before you reach kind of like your boiling point because, your partner's supposed to be the person that you love the most. And when you take a step back, you're like, I really don't want to hurt this person. I don't want to spiral on them. My boyfriend will tell me all the time, he's like, the dooms truck is not coming. You're fine. Like, just take a breather. He's like, you're spiraling. And I'm like, thank you for telling me that. Like, I actually needed that realization. But I also would love to know, like, is there an average time that you can kind of, when you recognize that you're dysregulated and you start doing things that maybe will re-regulate you a little bit to then become more regulated so that you can have that conversation or, get back to it? Or is everybody just so different?
These are really good questions. When it's a simple thing, I'll say simple, but let's just say it really is like a sensory overwhelm, like what we were just saying. It's hot, it's noisy, you're trying to think, and you're just like, there's too much going on. That can be quite quick. You can go outside and you can go for a walk, and it's like, okay, I've taken a deep breath. And you feel that sense in your body. But if we have an experience that is very similar to something previously in our life that our nervous system has learned was traumatic, or we lost agency, or we feel powerless, that can take quite a while. So let's just say we have a partner today that reminds us of a parent who may have been either avoidant, neglectful, or even, emotionally volatile. We might find that our partner might get angry about something and it feels similar to our past, and we find ourselves triggered. It could be all day. And I think what's really helpful for us to know is that our brain and nervous system operate by something that we call predictive coding. And so our emotions are often made or constructed through this reaction of what it's predicting is going to happen. It's not necessarily that our emotions are matching what's actually happening today. And this is where patterns continue because we predict unconsciously the same thing and our nervous system activates as it could have when we were 5. And this can be really challenging to undo. So one story from when I was 4 was my mum hurt her back really bad. And I was playing in my room and I heard her screaming from the lounge. And I ran out and I needed to call an ambulance for her. So I climbed up on a stool and I rang the ambulance. And I was waiting, thinking, oh my God, she's going to die. Like something really bad is going to happen here.
Yeah.
And the paramedics turned up and they carried her out. And it was so interesting that even though I didn't have the language to comprehend what happened, I remembered it from my body-based experience. And I grew up to become somebody who worked mostly treating lower back pain. And I had a pattern in every relationship of feeling responsible for helping people, for fixing people. And it wasn't until I met my husband did he say, oh, I think it was like our 3rd date. And he's like, why does everyone come up and tell you their problems all the time? And I was like, no, they don't. And he said, everywhere we go, people tell you their problems and you are like, you know, trying to talk them through it. And I was like, and so it was interesting having this new relationship where I didn't have to fix anyone. I didn't have to be responsible. I didn't have to be, doing. But that experience had encoded itself so deeply inside of me that I was playing out that pattern. And this is where I would swing to anxiety, thinking I had to do something or something bad would happen. So again, it's just a pattern of trying to keep us safe and trying to maintain love. But and like even now, if I'm really stressed, I can see it start, and I can learn to say, "Hang on a minute, I don't need to fix or do anything here." So it was really interesting. It's like that took me up until I was 30. I'm going to say 33 to unlearn that pattern. And I think this is just what can happen, and we keep getting triggered and stuck in the same cycles.
Yeah. And that's wild, and not to like dismiss what happened at all, because that is such a traumatic thing for a 4-year-old to go through, any child, but that it had such an impact on you up until, your adult life, and kind of how that played out in a different way. I was adopted as a baby and have amazing parents, but I've recently learned that I equate love with perfection. So I do similar, where I start getting anxious because I'm not performing at a perfect level.
Mm,
And I'm like, as an adult, I look back and I say, I don't need to be perfect. It's actually weird to be perfect and have every, plate spinning and I'm catching them all and I don't need anybody. So in dating in my healing era, I've started offloading things and asking for help and saying, I can't do this, knowing that I could, but it's not healthy either.
mm,
So it's interesting how things, so much over our lives, and going back to the very beginning where it's retraining your nervous system, and your nervous system may be stuck at when you were 4, when I was a baby, and I never took the time to retrain it and tell myself I didn't need to be perfect or that you didn't need to help someone all the time. And so now we're looking at it as grown adults with this huge binder of things that need to be unlearned.
exactly, exactly. And I think that's the process. Is we kind of touched on this at the start. It's like how we relate and attach to other people is a very neurobiological event. It's not necessarily something that we consciously say, like, you're dating who gave you the checklist, like that's very cognitive. But like there's almost this embodied way of relating that is very much outside of awareness, that we get cues of safety or warmth or connection from people that changes our physiology. And this ties in so beautifully to what we said about at the start about neuroplasticity, where we learn through experiences. And exactly what you said, there's some unlearning to do so that we can really love a person as they are today and they can love us as we are. And a lot of that is about undoing what's happened. And, it's hard because there is this part where, parents may not have had what they needed, or there's parts that, in no fault of ours, but there is a responsibility that we have, or we owe it to ourselves to really be loved, to be able to undo that. And I think if we have a partner who says to us, it's not doomsday, or for my husband, he has said to me before, you're not responsible for this. And that is just such a beautiful thing if they can know that about us and hold that mirror up so we can say, okay, I get it. I see what's happening, and support us in that process. And, the perfectionism part ties in so much to what we've said. Like perfectionism is a blended state where we do have flight in it. Like I've got to do more, I've got to go faster, I've got to keep this going, this, and this. But then it gets blended with shame and it turns into a paralysis where we're like, I don't know what to do. Like how do I keep bringing forward the perfection so I don't feel pain? But once we recognize that all strategies of this system we have trying to keep us safe, we can almost have a lot more kindness towards ourselves about it as well.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. I'm like taking it all in because it's so fantastic and it's so detailed. It seems so simple, but it's so detailed and like biological and the chemistry and all the things that you're talking about. But what is kind of like your way of working with people to regulate their nervous system? Where can people find you? Like how does that work if someone really wants to work with you?
Sure. Most of the time now, I train other clinicians and coaches through a nervous system certification course, but we do run once a year a vagus nerve program for people who want to help themselves. And both of those are all on my website, which is just my name, jessicamaguire.com. I do spend a lot of time on Instagram educating. So if you are a huge nerd and you want to come and learn more on this, then yeah, come on over and say hi.
Yes, all of your carousels. You probably won't see me, but like I'll swipe and then I'm like, wait, so I read this one, but now I need to like re-understand this one. And so I'm like swiping back and forth on your carousels because I'm like, there's so much information that I want to download and not lose. So her Instagram is phenomenal. It's very aesthetic too, which I love. But there's so many good nuggets. So thank you so much, Jessica, for being on the podcast. And if there is one thing that you could leave listeners with as it relates to love or repairing your nervous system or any life lessons, what would it be?
Thing would be around what we've said around the right person can be a corrective experience. And there's a lot of stories around dating we tend to tell ourselves when things are hard that can be, coupled with the past. But it is possible to come and see someone and see ourselves as we are today without that extra story through having that corrective experience and knowing that things can change, I think is so empowering and uplifting.
Yeah, we don't have to be the person that we were a week ago. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we could wake up tomorrow and say, I'm no longer going to be this person. I'm going to wake up and start healing. I'm going to get rid of old patterns. I'm going to do the research. I think, especially when we're adults, we have so many resources. There's podcasts and books and people like you on Instagram that just provide such good information at the tips of our fingers. So healing is, I don't want to say easy, but it's more accessible than it is when we're children or, back before the internet was really a thing.
Exactly. Yes, it's a great time to be able to create this change. And so many people are committed to it, which is amazing.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. I am so sorry for being late. I rushed home because this was such an important one for me. I'm really excited. Thank you for having time to be on the podcast.
It's been amazing. Thank you so much, Katelyn.
You're welcome. And that's a wrap on today's episode of Love in the Wild. If you laughed, nodded, cried, or texted your bestie mid-episode, you already know the drill. Don't keep it to yourself. Leave a review, share it in your stories, and tag me at Katelyn Sorry so I can hype you up right back. Remember, healing isn't linear, dating isn't a sport, and you're doing better than you think. Be soft, stay unbreakable, and I'll see you next week.